Hello, and welcome to Stories for Wonderful Children. I'm Dan Wendelin, your host and storyteller. Years ago, I began recording the bedtime stories I told my children every night. Now, I'd like to share those stories with you. I hope you enjoy my Stories for Wonderful Children. Once, very far away, there was a meadow. And this meadow was full of the greenest, lushest, tastiest, juiciest grass in all the world. Now in that meadow, there lived a very lucky flock of sheep. And in this flock of sheep, one spring, there was born a little lamb. His mommy and his daddy and his 5 sisters and his 6 brothers all spent a great deal of time trying to think of names for the new little lamb. His mommy and his daddy thought about naming him Ba, Ma, and they thought about naming him Ma, Ba, or the more traditional Ba, Ba, or the really sort of newfangled name of Ma, Ma. But they didn't feel like any of those really quite fit the new little lamb. And besides, he already had brothers and sisters named all of those names. And so they would have had to name him Ba, Ba the second or Ma, Ba Junior. And so they felt, after he had been around a couple days, that the name which really fit him best was a name that they had never heard of a sheep named before, and that was Hocus Pocus. Now, in most respects, Hocus Pocus was like any other little lamb. He played, and with the other lambs he liked to play tag. He liked to jump and run. He liked to eat a great deal. He liked to grow. And he liked to play tricks on his parents and the other grown-up sheep, like sneaking right up behind them when they were asleep and going, "Bah!" as loud as he could, and making them sort of jump and wake up. And he liked playing hide and seek with the other sheep. In all respects, Hocus Pocus was an ordinary little lamb. Well, all respects but one. You see, one day, his mommy and his daddy were looking around for him, and they found him sitting next to one of the large bushes in the meadow that was covered in yellow flowers. Now, most of the sheep ate grass, and none of the sheep ever ate from the bushes with the yellow flowers, because all of the other sheep thought that those bushes tasted terrible and smelled terrible. And all the mommy and daddy sheep told all the little lambs not to eat from the bushes with the yellow flowers because they would make them sick. But one day, Hocus Pocus was found by his mother and father contentedly munching on one of the bushes of the yellow flowers. There were clearly several flowers that had been bitten off, and he had several more in his mouth, which he swallowed as he saw them coming up. And his mother said, "Oh no, Hocus Pocus, we told you never to eat from that bush. What will happen now? Will he get sick? Oh no." And Hocus Pocus said, "But Mommy, I feel fine, and these are really very tasty. I don't know why nobody likes them." And his mother said, "Well, you stay away from those bushes. You run along and play now." And so he did. He ran along and he played, and his mother and his father took turns watching him all that afternoon to see if he displayed signs of illness, but he never did. He ran and he played, and he did all the fun things that he usually did, and he didn't even look slow or queasy. But then, about 3 hours after he'd eaten the bushes, something very unusual happened. They were playing tag, and Hocus Pocus had just tagged one of the other sheep, and he opened his mouth to say, "Bah, you're it!" But when he opened his mouth to say that, what came out of his mouth was not "bah," but instead was and a great gout of flame shot out of his mouth and just barely missed the other sheep, and all the other sheep were terrified and ran from him. And Hocus Pocus looked around and started running himself, wondering where the flame had come from. And then he stopped, and he tried, because everybody seemed to be running from him, and so he thought, did that come from me? And so he opened his mouth just a tiny bit to say just a quiet little "bah." But when he did that, again, little flame shot out of his mouth, not nearly as much this time. Well, sheep are terribly afraid of fire because they are covered in wool, and the last thing you would want if you were covered in flammable wool would be close to a fire.
I would not want to be near smoke.
No. And so the rest of the sheep made Hocus Pocus stand over in a corner of the meadow by himself until he stopped breathing fire. And then his mother and his father sat him down and instructed him very carefully that he was never to eat from the bushes of the yellow flowers again. And Hocus Pocus, for the most part, obeyed them. I say for the most part because he really, really liked the yellow flowers on the bushes. And so sometimes he would sneak away and quietly eat just one or two, not a whole lot. And then he would notice that his breath was a little flamey, a little hot. And so he would just not talk for a couple hours so no one would know. This went on for quite some time, and Hocus Pocus and the other little lambs grew up. And before long, it was fall and winter, and spring had come again. Hocus Pocus was a year old now, and he was no longer a lamb. He was a sheep, a young sheep, but a sheep. And he was for the most part an ordinary sheep, just like all the others. But that spring, something happened which had never happened before in the meadow. There came to the meadow a wolf. It was a great, shaggy, black wolf with great teeth and sharp claws. He had come to the meadow because he had heard that the sheep that lived in that meadow were the fattest and tastiest and most succulent sheep in all the world. And he wanted to taste one of them for himself. Well, the wolf lurked around the edges of the forest, hiding in the trees and watching them for quite some time, until he was sure that there were no dogs about guarding the sheep. There were no llamas about guarding the sheep, and there were no people about guarding the sheep. They were just sheep. And once he had satisfied himself of this, he charged into the clearing. The sheep immediately saw him, and although they had not seen a wolf before, they knew that this was something to be frightened of. And so they all ran as fast as they could, crying in their terrified voices, "Bah! Bah!" Well, they all ran around not knowing what to do, all of them except for Hocus Pocus. Hocus Pocus ran straight for the biggest bush covered in yellow flowers that he could find, and he immediately began chowing down. He just ate them as fast as he could. He was watching the wolf out of the corner of his eye. The wolf had chased some of the younger sheep and cornered them in one corner of the field, and now he was separating out one of them and chasing her down. Hocus Pocus could see that it was his sister. So he gulped down a last few flowers, and just as the wolf pounced on his sister, Hocus Pocus went charging across the meadow towards the wolf. Well, the wolf heard the hoofbeats behind behind him, and he turned and saw this little sheep charging towards him, and the wolf was not at all frightened. He thought, "Oh good, dessert." And so he grinned a great toothy grin and said, "Arr!" And Hocus Pocus skidded to a stop right in front of the wolf. His heart was beating very hard because he did not know what would happen next. It had been a long time since he had eaten any of the yellow flowers. He did not know if they would still work. He did not know whether they would work fast enough, because the other time that he had eaten yellow flowers, it had taken several hours before they had had the effect of making him breathe fire. And
Is he gonna be fire again?
And we'll have to find out. And so, as he skidded to a stop, he did not know whether he was about to save his sister or whether he was about to become a snack. And he opened his mouth to let out what he thought might be his very last bah. And he opened his mouth as wide as he could and took a deep breath and said, and a great wall of flame came out of Hocus Pocus's mouth and flew straight towards the wolf, and the wolf took one look at it and went and turned and ran from that meadow as fast as he could, and he never came back, and no other wolf ever came back to the meadow either, because that wolf told every other wolf he could find that the sheep in that field might be succulent and fat and slow and tasty, but they also breathed fire. And Hocus Pocus helped his sister up, and she fortunately was not hurt. And from that day on, no sheep ever complained again about Hocus Pocus eating the flowers. And they were happy. And that's the end of the story. Thanks for listening to Stories for Wonderful Children. Today's story was created and edited by me, Dan Wendelin. Commentary was supplied by my children. Intro and outro music composed by Brandon Thompson. If you enjoyed the story, please tell someone about it or leave a review on iTunes. If you'd like to, you can contact us by email at storiesforwonderfulchildren@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.